Have you ever stopped to think how far you might go if the situation pushed you? Could it be that, in some way, we're all closer than we think, to crossing that moral line we believe is unbreakable? Sometimes, we assume our choices and actions are guided by an unwavering inner compass, something that defines us as good or bad. But what if the very essence of that compass could be shaped by the pressures and circumstances around us, pushing even the most ordinary person into situations they never imagined? Picture, for a moment, those small decisions we make every day, often just to please someone or avoid the judgment of those around us. It starts subtly, a choice here, a small sidestep there, and suddenly, we're faced with a mirror showing us something we didn't think possible. This is where an uncomfortable thought begins to emerge. Just how much can the environment around us and the voices nearby, without us even realizing it, reshape our own sense of right and wrong? Sometimes, the line separating a moral action from an ethical transgression is so thin that we don't even notice when it begins to blur. For many people, the idea of crossing a moral line sounds absurd, even impossible. But is it? Social pressure, the environment we live in, and even everyday dilemmas can quietly lead us to make choices that challenge our most basic values. Imagine a common situation. Someone in a position of authority asks us to do something a little questionable. Maybe it's nothing severe, just something that slightly conflicts with our sense of right. At first, we hesitate, but go along. Maybe out of a need for acceptance, fear of opposing them, or simply because we trust the person guiding us. And then, in the blink of an eye, this path of small concessions becomes a chasm. With each step, we stray further from that first moral conviction, crossing boundaries that once seemed immovable. This is the moral abyss, a place where our integrity is threatened by the forces around us, and where often the line between right and wrong blurs and fades. The question that remains is, how many of us could resist these pressures? And to what extent is it possible to keep our morals intact in a world that constantly tests our boundaries? When we talk about the Lucifer effect, we're delving into one of the most unsettling aspects of human behavior, inspired by the famous Stanford prison experiment conducted by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. The term describes a phenomenon where ordinary people, individuals who see themselves as morally upright and ethical, become capable of cruelty and dehumanization. This effect forces us to question our own nature and realize that the circumstances surrounding us can indeed shape our attitudes profoundly. Blurring the line between good and evil, Zimbardo showed that, given the right conditions, any one of us might act in ways we'd never consider possible. In the experiment, participants, divided into guards and prisoners, took on their roles with such intensity that some guards began to impose humiliations on the prisoners, even though they were merely acting. And the scariest part, none of them had previously been violent or inclined to behave tyrannically. Over time, those in charge began to justify their actions based on the role they'd taken on, convincing themselves it was part of a larger structure, a context that authorized them to cross lines. This transformation isn't simply a matter of bad character or hidden malice. It's a reaction to the power of the environment, to authority, and to the distancing from those who suffer the aggression when placed in situations of absolute control, where there's no direct accountability and where the other is seen as a number, or even as something lesser. We become vulnerable to reshaping our morality into a matter of convenience. And this goes beyond a single experiment. In everyday life, how often do we see people justifying questionable actions as part of the system, or just a rule, in workplaces, for instance? It's easy to fall into the trap of treating subordinates as resources, enforcing rigid rules that, at their core, dehumanize those affected, often under the justification that it's company policy. Zimbardo explains that this phenomenon isn't about particularly bad individuals. It's about how the context can make anyone susceptible to acting in inhumane ways, because by delegating responsibility to something bigger, an authority, an ideology, or even a job role, we avoid the moral weight of our actions. This disconnect from real consequences, from the humanity of the other person, makes us almost insensitive, distanced from our own ethical sense. Thus, the Lucifer effect challenges us to look inward, to accept that under specific conditions and external pressures, our choices can veer from what we believe is right, revealing a side we'd never imagine existed. And this is the central question. To what extent are we prepared to resist pressures inviting us to cross lines? Wouldn't any of us, in situations of absolute power, or where there's no risk of retaliation, be tempted to do things we would never consider in other circumstances? Zimbardo leaves this question open, but it becomes a call to reflect on our own ability to maintain self-control, empathy, and ethics, even when faced with situations that urge us toward the darker side of our nature. Social psychology has a wealth of experiments revealing just how much human behavior can be shaped by external forces, and few are as revealing as those conducted by Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo. These studies not only shocked the academic world, but also the general public by unveiling how social context and authority can turn ordinary people into authoritarian figures capable of unthinkable actions. Milgram's experiment, for instance, revealed that the mere presence of an authority figure can cause a person to commit acts that go against their principles. In the study, participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner every time they got an answer wrong. Shocks that, in reality, were simulated. However, the participants believed the procedure was real, and, shockingly, they continued administering shocks up to potentially fatal levels, simply because an authority figure directed them to proceed. Milgram demonstrated that the desire to obey can override personal morality when there is someone else taking responsibility for what is happening. This willingness to obey blindly leads many to ignore the consequences of their actions, overlooking that the simple act of following orders can be a trap for individual ethics. Another remarkable example is the Stanford prison experiment, conducted by Zimbardo. In this study, college students were divided into guards and prisoners, and within just the first few days, the guards' behavior escalated to abuse, punishment, and humiliation. The prisoners, in turn, began adopting submissive behaviors, cowed by the authority their fellow students had begun to wield. This experiment revealed how power assigned by context can corrupt morality, pushing individuals to take on roles and behaviors they would vehemently reject in other circumstances. Zimbardo observed that many of the guards justified their actions as part of their duties, using the environment as an excuse for violence and dehumanization. These experiments challenge us to reflect on the role of authority and conformity in our daily lives. After all, how often do we accept impositions without questioning them, simply because they're part of a hierarchical system or come from a respected source? If, in controlled and temporary situations like the Milgram and Zimbardo experiments, we are capable of transforming our attitudes so drastically, what can we say about real-world scenarios where the consequences are permanent? The lessons from these studies serve as a warning about the importance of questioning authority and recognizing the dangers of blind conformity, reminding us that no matter how strong the context, an individual should preserve their critical thinking and moral values. Dehumanization is a powerful tool that, throughout history, has facilitated humanity's greatest atrocities. But before we see this as something distant, it's worth noting that this process doesn't occur solely in wartime or under totalitarian regimes. It's present in everyday life, in practices that reduce others to something less than human, making it easier to justify acts of cruelty and insensitivity, and this often happens through euphemistic language, which masks the severity of actions and diminishes the empathy of those carrying them out. Let's take, for example, the terminology used in workplaces, where expressions like human resources and staff cuts reduce people to numbers and statistics. This choice of words softens reality and makes it easier to justify decisions that directly affect individuals' lives. By treating someone as a resource rather than a person, we begin to look at them with less compassion, more focused on results than on human impact. This subtle dehumanization present in corporate language is a small-scale version of what is seen in more intense conflicts, such as war, where the enemy is often described with words that suggest inferiority or threat, undermining their humanity. In more extreme contexts, this dehumanization intensifies to the point where psychological violence becomes a common practice. In historical conflicts, propaganda portraying a group as an imminent threat justifies, in the eyes of many, any kind of violence against that group. Once the other is seen as less human or even dangerous, the practice of abuse becomes rationalized, and this goes beyond physical violence. there is a psychological violence that takes hold, where groups and individuals begin to be treated in a demeaning way, disregarding their individuality and complexity. This process of dehumanization leads to a moral erosion that is gradual but relentless, through small, everyday actions. With words that minimize or ridicule, we feed this same cycle, which fosters insensitivity and creates distance. This raises the question: to what extent are we, consciously or not, participating in this process of dehumanization? And once we become aware of it, are we capable of rebuilding the empathy needed to resist any form of violence, be it physical or psychological? Perhaps the answer lies in the awareness that all of us, even unknowingly, can end up contributing to this web of dehumanization. It is up to us to interrupt this cycle by recognizing and restoring humanity in each action and word. If there is something that truly distinguishes who we are from who we wish to be, it is our ability to resist and make conscious choices in the face of external pressures and impositions. In a world where the environment constantly invites us to follow conventions and obey authority figures unquestioningly, resistance becomes an essential skill, a tool of defense against the conformity that so often compromises our values. But what does it mean to resist? And how do we cultivate the awareness necessary to make decisions aligned with our principles? Resistance begins with the ability to question and reflect on the orders, expectations, and norms presented to us. Throughout history, many individuals who chose not to yield to impositions succeeded in transforming their environments, standing firm in their values despite the consequences. Let's consider, for instance, those who, across different periods, defied totalitarian regimes or refused to cooperate with injustices, even knowing that this choice would demand great personal sacrifices. This resistance wasn't limited to extraordinary courage. It was also an expression of inner freedom, of a conscious choice between blind obedience and acting with integrity. And we don't have to look far to see this in our daily lives. How often are we pressured to adopt behaviors that don't align with our beliefs, simply to fit in or please those around us? The decision to resist in these cases isn't always dramatic or heroic. It is often a quiet act of self-awareness and moral steadfastness. It's the choice to stay true to one's own values, even when the environment does otherwise. In work situations, for example, resistance might mean refusing to engage in dishonest practices or to treat colleagues with less respect just because that's the prevailing culture. Thus, the power of resistance and conscious choice lies in the ability to recognize these situations and reaffirm our own ethical boundaries. It's not about adopting a confrontational stance, but rather about self-awareness, a responsibility to oneself that prevents one from becoming a mere reflection of the surrounding circumstances. To resist, in this sense, is to exercise a kind of freedom that strengthens as we decide consciously who we want to be, in every small choice we make. And it is this inner freedom that allows us to challenge any external imposition, keeping us connected to our own essence. Group pressure is as powerful as it is silent. When we're in a group, especially one that is familiar or important to us, the tendency to conform, to act like others in order to be accepted, becomes almost automatic. Sometimes we don't even notice how much the desire to belong leads us to make concessions, big and small, in how we think and act. And that's where the danger lies. This conformity, which starts with small adjustments, can transform into a total commitment to ideas and behaviors that, individually, we might never adopt. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated this clearly in his conformity experiments. He showed that, in situations where a group responds unanimously, individuals tend to align their answers with the group consensus. Even if they know they're wrong, the desire to fit in and avoid the discomfort of being the dissenting voice can, in many cases, override our own sense of truth. This is reflected in everyday behaviors, such as laughing at a joke we find offensive, agreeing with the majority opinion even when we disagree, or staying silent when we witness an injustice, all to avoid the critical gaze or judgment of those around us. And it's not just about wanting to please others. There is a psychological vulnerability within us that makes social rejection painful and, in some cases, even traumatic. For many, going against the opinion of a close group feels like a threat to their very identity, as being part of something larger provides a sense of security and belonging. This is why social conformity can lead even people with firm values to engage in questionable acts. When we're led to participate in something that the group considers normal, even if deep down we feel it's wrong, the tendency is to justify to ourselves that it's not that bad, giving in a bit with each new situation. The reflection this provokes is essential. To what extent can we remain true to ourselves in the face of group pressure? And are we willing to endure the discomfort of being the exception when our principles are challenged? Recognizing this pressure is the first step toward resisting conformity and, consciously, affirming our convictions. After all, being authentic often does mean standing alone, but it also means preserving integrity and respect for who we are. Philosopher Hannah Arendt coined the term the banality of evil when observing how ordinary people, by becoming involved in power structures or rigid systems, can commit atrocious acts without questioning their actions. Arendt studied how individuals become perpetrators of horrible acts, not out of hatred or explicit malice, but from a simple commitment to their duties and a desire to follow orders. In practice, the banality of evil arises when, in the performance of normal tasks and the pursuit of efficiency, people stop reflecting on the consequences of their actions, allowing atrocities to happen out of pure moral inertia. This concept makes us reflect on everyday situations where we prefer to follow instructions or comply with a rule, even when we feel discomfort or disagreement. Think about how often we hear phrases like, "I was just doing my job," or "I was only following orders." In corporate contexts, the banality of evil can be seen in the lack of questioning abusive practices, such as excessive pressure on colleagues or management decisions that harm employees in an inhumane way. At its core, it's an unconscious acceptance that moral responsibility has been shifted to the larger structure, be it a company, an institution, or a government system. The danger here is that by accepting the role of merely a cog in the system, we lose the capacity for empathy and critical reflection on our own actions. This depersonalization of the act, where each individual sees themselves as just a gear in the machine, allows cruel behaviors to become routine. However, Arendt warns us that this routine, this banality, is a trap that distances us from the true value of personal ethics. With each automatic decision, where we choose to follow orders without questioning, we move further away from our individual responsibility and, ultimately, from our humanity. This concept brings us to an essential question. To what extent are we willing to bear the weight of our actions, without outsourcing morality to the system? The banality of evil reminds us of the importance of reflecting and deciding for ourselves, regardless of norms and orders, reclaiming the autonomy and sense of justice that should always be present. Even in the smallest gestures, ideologies are powerful forces. They have the ability to make sense of the world, unite people around a shared vision, and provide purpose. However, when taken to extremes, ideologies can also turn into justifications for acts of violence and cruelty. Fanaticism arises precisely when adherence to an ideology becomes so strong that it eclipses critical thinking and empathy, leading the individual to see those who think differently as enemies or threats. In the name of a cause, an ideal, or a belief, many end up blinding themselves to the morality of their own actions, believing that the ends justify the means. This phenomenon is evident at various points in history and isn't limited to contexts of war or religion. In totalitarian regimes, for instance, state ideology is used to justify persecutions and abuses against minorities, creating an environment where violence is seen not only as acceptable, but as necessary for the common good. When an individual is convinced they are fighting for a higher cause, they begin to view their actions as noble, regardless of the suffering they may cause. This is a fundamental characteristic of fanaticism. It distorts reality to the point where any questioning is seen as betrayal, and any dissent a threat. And this is a trap that no group or individual is immune to. Even in smaller contexts, fervent belief in an ideology can lead to hostile attitudes, the isolation of those who disagree, and the perpetuation of prejudice in political debates, organizations, and even personal relationships. Ideological fanaticism leads to judgment and dehumanization of others. By identifying absolutely with an idea or movement, the individual loses the ability to see the complexity and dignity of those who don't share their vision. The reflection this topic brings us is powerful. To what extent are we aware of the influence ideologies have on our actions and perceptions? And are we able to question our own beliefs before they lead us to see others as threats or as the enemy? This questioning is what allows us to honestly reassess the line between defending a cause and falling into the trap of dehumanizing those who think differently when we look at someone and see them only as a category, whether a number, an opponent, or even as an impersonal other. We create space for depersonalization. This phenomenon occurs when, intentionally or not, we start seeing others as less human, making it easier to engage in insensitive or cruel actions with less guilt. This psychology of distancing, of treating others impersonally, is dangerous because it allows empathy, which connects us to others' suffering and joy, to be silenced. Depersonalization is evident in contexts ranging from the workplace to conflicts between groups. In companies, for example, employees in higher-ranking positions may refer to others as resources or assets. These terms dehumanize, stripping employees of their identity and individuality, making it easier to make decisions that negatively impact them without reflecting on the human consequences of these decisions. On a broader scale, in political or social conflicts, the use of derogatory terms and stereotypes creates a depersonalized image of the enemy, leading to the idea that those who think differently or belong to another group are, in some way, inferior or even threatening. And what about interactions on social media, on platforms where communication happens between avatars and almost anonymous users? People feel distant from the reality of the other. This distancing is fertile ground for aggression and extreme judgments because when we only see a digital profile, we forget that behind each comment is a person with their own complexities and vulnerabilities. This phenomenon creates a sort of license to act in ways that would not be acceptable in a face-to-face interaction, where the other person's face and expression remind us of their humanity. The psychology of distancing invites us to reflect on the mechanisms that separate us from others and gradually erode our capacity for empathy. If, instead of seeing others as objects or functions, we can see them as complete human beings, we create space for a more ethical and compassionate coexistence. After all, it's in our ability to recognize others' dignity and individuality that true respect for differences resides. The practice of harmful or insensitive acts rarely starts with major decisions. In many cases, it unfolds as a series of small, almost imperceptible steps that take an individual further from their own principles. This gradual escalation of toxic behaviors is subtle, happening so slowly that a person may not even notice they are drifting from their own sense of right and wrong. The danger lies precisely in this cumulative process, where small deviations, when repeated and compounded, eventually become the norm themselves. Imagine someone who, in the workplace, starts adopting small competitive and unfair behaviors. At first, it might just be derogatory comments about colleagues or subtle manipulation of information. These actions might be justified as minor things, or even as necessary practices for success. However, these small acts lay the groundwork for more drastic behaviors, and what was once an exception, an ethical line they hesitated to cross, now becomes part of their daily routine, without the same pang of conscience. This escalation is also visible in historical and social contexts. Authoritarian regimes, for instance, don't enforce absolute repression policies all at once. Instead, they start with moderate measures that seem justifiable or even necessary for social welfare. Over time, these practices evolve into more extreme forms of control and repression. As the public becomes more desensitized and accustomed to the loss of certain freedoms and rights, each concession adds up, making each new measure easier to accept, until the unthinkable becomes part of daily life. The concept of a gradual escalation of toxic behaviors reminds us of the importance of being vigilant about our own actions, even those that seem harmless. Small behavioral deviations can be the beginning of a path that leads us away from our values, making us comfortable with practices and attitudes we never imagined accepting. This reflection is an invitation to self-critique. To what extent are we aware of the steps we take and the justifications we give? Are we alert to signs that something is wrong? Or have we already crossed a line without even noticing? Moral integrity depends on this ability to recognize our own steps and to stop the cycle before it becomes irreversible. In the end, it's not only the world around us that influences what we do, but also our choices in the face of these pressures. Even in the most difficult situations, we have the power to act with integrity. By understanding that we are responsible for the narrative of our own morality, we remember that we are capable of both good and evil, but the final decision is always ours. Every day, we choose the kind of person we want to be, and this choice, though quiet, defines our entire story. Small attitudes and everyday decisions accumulate to form the foundation of our character, and it is in this moral commitment, with each gesture and conscious choice, that we truly shape the impact we want to leave on the world